So the book of Judges is an unusual book in some ways, but given the times in which we live, it really is not. Especially if you've been following the events of the last 2 days, it does seem as if times of anarchy are not rare, perhaps are not going to be rare. So in that context, the book of Judges does not seem to be a strange book that has nothing to speak to our present situation. It is very relevant. There is a lot of gore in it. The Bible does not gloss over the failures of humanity. It is not a mythological book, or it is not a collection of children's tales. Often people will criticize the violence in the Bible, or the accounts in the Bible, or the descriptions of gore, immorality in the Bible. The Bible is not glorifying any of these events. It is giving us a clear picture of the condition of the human heart and the extent of the depravity that man is capable of if his worst impulses are not controlled by God, directed by good men. And that's really what we will get an overview of in the book of Judges. So this book was written, compiled by an unknown author. However, the tradition does attribute it to Samuel. Samuel was the last of the judges. But it was written by whoever the author was, whether it was Samuel or somebody else. It was written by someone in the early parts of the monarchy. The first king of Israel was King Saul, and it is believed that it is in those early days that Samuel likely compiled the events in the book which we now know as Judges. When you hear the word Judges, you think that, well, these are very similar to our present day judges. It is talking about a judicial system with a courtroom and judges and a jury. But it is really talking about individuals who were specifically raised by God for the task of delivering his people Israel from their oppressors. And who were their oppressors? The very people that God had commanded the Israelites to drive out from the land of Canaan, the promised land that God had allotted to the Israelites. The promise he had made to their ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. What happens, unfortunately, is that Israel does follow God faithfully during the lifetime of Joshua, who is the leader who brings the Israelites into the promised land. As long as Joshua is alive and the leaders who are with Joshua are alive, Israel follows God, is faithful to keep his commandments. However, things change after Joshua's death. The Israelites do not obey the command that God had given, the clear command, which is you are to drive out the Amorites, the Canaanites, from this land that God has given you. And why is that? It is because God knew that they would be entirely captivated by the philosophies, by the practices, by the idolatry, and by the wickedness of the nations that surrounded them. They were instructed by God to break down their altars and to drive them out within the confines of the geography that God had bounded for them. So this is not a willy-nilly massive geographical universal mandate. God had defined boundaries for Israel just as God had defined boundaries for other nations as well. Israel had no right to trample on the rights of the people of the other nations to inhabit their own lands. This is only about the specific territory that God had assigned to the Israelites. They were not to step out of his very specific mandate. He had defined the geographical borders. Based on that, Joshua and Moses before him had allotted territories to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Some do a better job than others. The others are more lackadaisical. They do not obey the command of God, at least fully, and they are laid back. And they think that they will ally with the people, mix and mingle with them, intermarry with them. But instead of the Israelites influencing the Canaanites, what happens is that the Canaanites influence the Israelites, so that the Israelite practices are no longer distinguishable from the Canaanite practices which God abhorred. God, the just God, God, the giver of the moral law, abhorred the evil practices of the Canaanites and had explicitly commanded the Israelites that you are not to be like them. And that is the reason that God had wanted the Israelites to drive out the Canaanites from their land. He knew that coexistence would lead to compromise. Now, 7 years in the lifetime of Joshua, the Israelites take large parts of the land, but not entirely. They take portions of the land little by little. The book of Judges, one way to think of this book is that it is written as a warning to kings that were going to follow in the period of the monarchy to rightly lead the people. There is one verse that is a common refrain throughout this book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. They did not bow to the commands of God. They had no ruler over them. Tribal warfare was rampant. There was civil war brewing. We'll see some disturbing chapters at the end of Judges. And really, it was each man to his own. They defined morality for their own selves, pretty much like the nations surrounding them that did not have the law of God. And this is a situation that is unbearable to God, because he had intended that these will be a people who will reflect his character, reflect his goodness, reflect his morality, and be a light unto the nations, and not be dragged into the mud along with the rest of them. So this verse is actually a good one for us to reflect on today. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It is not unlike the condition in which we find ourselves in today. We then have a responsibility to reject what culture determines as morality and instead stick to what we know to be universal, timeless truths based on God's unchanging law. So again, keep in mind that Judges is a book with various disturbing scenes. It will bother us. And I think the intent is that God wished to preserve these details in the book of Judges so that we will never be casual, unaware, ignorant about the depths to which human beings are capable of sinking to. That includes us, if the hand of God were not to be on us. And that also gives us a responsibility. We cannot be casual. We cannot assume that once people have a level of enlightenment based upon the law of God, they can be trusted to simply pass it down from generation to generation. No, each generation has to fight to preserve goodness in society, to preserve morality in society. Christians have a responsibility, which is why the book of Judges does not mince words. And it's very pertinent to us today. If you've been following the events of the last few days, as I mentioned earlier, it has been extremely disturbing, in several ways unthinkable to Americans. However, the warning of Judges is timely and applicable. Freedom, liberty, justice, equality, all of the good things that are directly derived from the Bible will be sustainable only so long as the Bible is the foundation. Separate the Bible, the rest of the house will collapse. What was happening in the Promised Land at this time? If you look at this chart here, it's quite helpful. It spans a period of 350 years and covers the period from the first judge until the events towards the end of the book of Judges. And Samuel, although he's not mentioned in the book of Judges, is the last judge. It is a time of moral anarchy. Like I said, Israel was faithful to God only so long as there was a federal leader, a national leader, Joshua. After he dies, people collapse into their own tribes and they are satisfied to do as they deem fit. They follow the practices of the Canaanites. They begin to worship idols. They begin to worship Baal, Asherah, and engage in worship of other idols. God, if you remember his injunctions in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses, before his death, reminds the Israelites that you have to pass this down to your children. Tell them about what God has done for you. Tell them how God miraculously delivered you from the hands of your oppressors in Egypt. How he brought you out, how he provided for you. His law has to be on your foreheads. You have to be ready for action. You have to hide it deep within your hearts. The Israelites have strayed so far from the instructions of Moses. The Israelites disobey God and they are in extreme rebellion. They're completely influenced by the pagan, immoral activities of the surrounding peoples. And we will find that the surrounding people engaged in brutality, barbarity. They did not have laws to govern them. They engaged in ritual prostitution, human sacrifices, things that God finds despicable. And God wanted to preserve a people that will be very distinct in the way they worship God, not according to the whims of their own nature, but according to the terms that God has set. And this God also cares about how people treat each other. He cares about how the Israelites treated their own brothers and sisters, how they treated their children, values which the neighboring cultures did not have. But if they are fully indistinguishable from the neighboring cultures that are wicked, how will they be any light? How will they be any positive influence? And so we find that the book of Judges is a description of a spiral of idolatry, punishment by God, oppression by strong and cruel people, and then God raising up a deliverer when the people cry out to God for help. And this is a pattern. You find that the Israelites don't really learn. They are oppressed, worked to their bones, cruelly treated. They have no right to their own land, their own crops. Miserable, they cry out to God, and God raises for them a deliverer. And as long as that judge is alive, the Israelites rein in their worst impulses. They turn to God, at least partially. And then after his death, it begins again. And each time, they're not going back to how they used to be. It is actually becoming worse. They are becoming worse with each degradation. With each fall, they are becoming worse. Because that is the tendency of sin. Once you become comfortable with immoral activities, once your conscience is seared, it is easier the next time around to do worse things. God is fully aware of the hardness and the tendencies of the human heart. God allows the oppressors to have a heavy hand on his people for a few reasons. One, he wants them to learn a lesson. God had given them clear instructions. Disobey God and you will experience the consequences of your disobedience. It was also a test. God had given them a clear mandate. God had told them that I will be with you. Go out and drive the people out who will be a cancer to your way of living. Destroy their pagan altars. Influence them by being completely distinct from them. Do not be one with them. The other thing is that remember, this is a generation that has not necessarily experienced the hardship and the conditions of war that the generation that was living at the time of Joshua had experienced. They were relatively comfortable. They were willing, after 7 years of conquest and their fathers having been engaged in war, they just wanted to settle in, eat the produce of the land. Let the unfinished work be. It is all right. They just wanted to rest. There are parts of that we can sympathize with. However, it was unfinished business. God had directed them. They should have trusted God. So with the oppression, the Israelites are also being trained for battle, else they would have become completely soft, ineffective, when the rest of the regions were actually developing advanced weapons. They were having iron chariots, developing more advanced methods of warfare. The Israelites, if they were living comfortably, would have been completely untouched by the developing techniques, ignorant of war, and at the times of oppression, they would have been very, very helpless. So, to mitigate the losses to them, God is also using these oppressive experiences as training for self defense, for warfare, and to teach them, to train them to do battle. God is using the misdeeds, the wrong acts, the errors of judgment of His people in a very wise way, as only God can. He is giving this generation opportunities to trust God. Even if they had failed, they had with each failure an opportunity to rise up again, refuse to continue the spiral of deterioration, and choose to trust God and pick up from where they left off, following God's commandments. They could have strengthened themselves, prepared themselves to follow God's will completely, and they would have seen massive success because God had already promised them that this land belongs to you. I am with you. Go in and take possession. It was a done deal. With God, it was future perfect, even if the actual act had not yet taken place. Even if it was scary, they should have chosen to trust God instead of choosing the path of comfort, which ultimately was not comfortable at all. It was hardship. It was payment for their sin. It appears free, but it never is. They intermarry with the Amorites, they mix and mingle with them, and they lose the sense of purpose, the divine purpose for which God had raised them. So look at the various tribes of Israel in this land here. Present day Israel, although present day Israel is not nearly as big, they have land to the east of the Jordan, the land allocated to each of the tribes, and God is raising a wide variety of judges from various tribes. Sometimes their oppressors were more regional, meaning the trouble was more regional. On other times, it was pretty much throughout the whole land. There is a very interesting archaeological find which points to this time. It is an extra biblical reference. This is an inscription by Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the title of the ruler of Egypt. Egypt was the world's dominant power at the time, exerting influence over surrounding nations, including Canaan. Canaan was not one nation. It was a loose federation of cities and states, each with their own local rulers, all of whom owed allegiance to the king of Egypt. Some of them had begun to revolt, and Israel was causing problems to the power balance in that region. So that's what this inscription is about. If you look to the right here, this image is a granite slab 10 feet high. It is presently exhibited in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It is called the Merneptah Victory Stele. It is an inscription by Pharaoh Merneptah. He's the successor to the more famous Pharaoh Ramesses II. Merneptah reigned from 1213 to 1203 BCE, and this is the earliest textual reference to ancient Israel in the ancient Near East outside of the Bible. So it is a great corroboration to Israel's presence in the land at the time of the judges. It is widely considered to be authentic. It provides historical information, and it was discovered in Pharaoh Merneptah's funerary temple, which was a practice that the Egyptians had to deify pharaohs. Pharaohs were not considered merely as men, but they were treated as man gods, and after their deaths, usually there were temples created to honor them for their divine status. And so the inscription has got a passage which is referencing a campaign in the east, to the east of Egypt, where some of the Canaanite cities had revolted. And it says, plundered is the Canaan with every evil, carried off as Askaluni, seized upon as Gezer, Yanoam is made non-existent, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. So this is the Pharaoh bragging about his military victory, about quashing a regional revolt in the land of Canaan. It's interesting to us because it points to Israel by a ruler of the time who lived and ruled from 1213 to 1203 BCE and discovered after his death in his funerary temple, pointing to the times of the judges. So it is really interesting that the events of the Bible, and this is one of them, can actually be corroborated by inscriptions, recordings, finds, artifacts from outside the Bible. So these are historical events, real events that happened to real people and not myths and fables.